Welcome back to another webinar from Australian Wildlife Conservancy. I'm Joey Clarke, Senior Science Communicator with AWC, and today I'm speaking to you from Sydney, where I live and work on Gadigal country. We have a great conversation ahead about how wildlife copes with extreme temperatures and what we can do to help give species the best chance at survival into the future. To get us started, I'd like to introduce AWC Chief Executive Tim Allard, who is joining us from Perth today. Hello, Tim. And Tim, can you let us know what the weather is forecast for in Perth today?
Well, thanks, Joey, and welcome everybody. And I just want a particular shout out to our Copy Circle members, very special people to AWC that really give us a surety of our work into the future. But today is a pretty important topic. And as I said, it's 39 degrees here in Perth today, which is really underscoring what's happening in the world in which we live with a changing climate that we all know about. And we're going to hear a bit about this from Jenny and Joey shortly. But part of the reason of doing this talk today is to really understand what your support is allowing to occur. At AWC, we've got a headcount now of 260 people. 80 of those are in the science team. And around 20% of our team have got PhDs, people like Jenny, who bring this incredible level of expertise, depth of knowledge and capability to the organisation. So we do live in a world of gloom and despair and negativity. But when we have a team like we do at AWC, in terms of what your funding has allowed us to create, there is hope in terms of what we're doing. And so I'm really looking forward personally to what Jenny's going to talk about today, Joey. So it's a really interesting time in which we live. Despite the impacts of a changing climate, there's a lot we can do about that. And there's a lot of very interesting research to really help answer the questions of what we need to do. So I'm really looking forward to it. So for everybody that's joined, for all the donors that are part of it, for those who have given a gift to AWC, thank you very much. And I really look forward to hearing the next 30 minutes or so.
Thanks, Tim. Well, we'll get into it. So as Australia moves from the hottest spring on record into yet another sweltering summer, we are all feeling the heat. Think about what the weather has been like the last few weeks, wherever you are in Australia. I know in Sydney, it's felt like Singapore or something with very high humidity and high temperatures. Extreme weather, including drought and heat waves, is going to increase over the coming decades, and that will affect wildlife and ecosystems. And with that knowledge, it's easy to fall into despair. We sometimes think, how can we have any confidence that this conservation work we're doing now won't be completely overwhelmed as the world gets hotter and drier? But it's no good thinking like that. The truth is that ecosystems and species can show amazing resilience as environments change. And understanding that adaptability, I think, is where we can find some hope for the future. So at AWC, rather than despair, we're urgently trying to understand how species cope in extreme conditions and what we might be able to do to help them thrive. So to talk about that today, I'm joined by Dr. Jenny Pierson, a senior ecologist with AWC and part of the national science team based in Jervis Bay, where it's currently 24 degrees, a bit more comfortable than Perth. Among lots of other projects, Jenny has been leading AWC's work on climate change adaptation and collaborating with our crew at Mount Gibson last summer, embarked on this project to investigate how the Numbats at Mount Gibson cope in that extreme heat. And that was over a few very hot months at Mount Gibson. So welcome, Jenny, from Jervis Bay.
Thanks, Joey. It's really nice to be here today. And yes, it's much more pleasant down here. I'm joining you from Ewan country where I live and work.
Thanks, Jenny. So you were over at Mount Gibson last summer to set up this project, looking at how Numbats cope under prolonged periods of extreme heat. And it coincided with a heat wave just by chance. Can you describe what it was like getting to Mount Gibson and doing field work in that sort of temperature?
It was really, really interesting, Joey, because we planned the study to start in late November with the idea that we wanted to capture kind of the range of conditions that Numbats would experience throughout the year. So we assumed if we went there in late November, we'd get, what we would consider kind of the less extreme conditions. And then maybe once we got into January and early February, we'd capture, hopefully in the context, a heat wave and see what they did under extreme heat. Well, as soon as we arrived, it was, a heat wave upon getting there. And that really changed things even in terms of, how the humans were able to cope, because, where we were staying and the conditions that we were, working in and living in weren't air conditioned. We weren't ready for the heat. And so we had, one little room where even as humans, we were gathering together that was air conditioned to take our own shelter. And we also had to modify a little bit, the time of days that we were working just to avoid that kind of extreme heat from humans as well. And so it's one of those things where, even planning this kind of field work, the unpredictability that we're dealing with and trying to capture these things is really changing for us. So when
Mm.
we looked at it, we have a bit of a summary from that year where, from the 22nd of November to the 4th of February, when we did the study, we only had 15 days that whole time where the high was less than 35. So
Wow.
the really good news is we captured an extraordinary amount of data in terms of extreme heat. And so from the study's point of view, we're going to have a wealth of data to be able to really evaluate the range of conditions that they do. And luckily, in terms of the less extreme conditions, we partnered with another study while we did this, and the other site was able to get less extreme conditions.
Right. And I think that's Secret Rocks in South Australia. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, Secret Rocks, and Secret Rocks by chance had a much less extreme year. And so we actually designed the study to collect the same data at both sites. And so the partner from Secret Rocks actually came with us to Mount Gibson that first weekend. And so before the field teams came in to collect the data, myself and two others went there and were, field testing essentially what you design. You can sit here down in Jervis Bay and say, oh, this is what we're going to collect at Mount Gibson, but you really have to get on the ground to see what's going to work. So we spent the weekend there. And first off, testing will these, brand new collars we had designed work on the animals? Will the shelter data we collect make sense? And then just test the, technology in general in terms of how to download it, all that sort of stuff. And as soon as we got there, we realized some of the things would have to be modified, and we were able to really streamline things to make sure that we were collecting the same data at both sites to maximize what we were learning in terms of the conditions both at Mount Gibson, but more generally for Numbats. And I think that's one of the, really important things, is to make sure we can have this, at a species-wide level, understand how this information can help manage the species and recover it.
Great. That's such a clever experimental setup to have those two sites, the same techniques being used to gather the same sort of data, but obviously different prevailing conditions. It's, that's what we learned to do in science. So yeah, describe a little about the landscape at Mount Gibson. So for context, and I'm sure many people would be familiar with this, Mount Gibson is our sanctuary north of Perth in the Wheatbelt region. It includes one of the largest fenced safe havens in Australia. So how big is it again? Almost 8,000 hectares, I think.
Yeah.
And within that safe haven, we've restored now, we've released 10 species. Most of them have gone on to become established, and the Numbat population there is doing well. But what's it actually like when you're on the ground? What's the habitat look like? What are the trees like?
It was so absolutely beautiful to visit Mount Gibson. It's always incredible to go to these sanctuaries because, they're often so much, you can look at pictures of them, but you get on the ground and there's so much, richer in terms of the diversity once you get there. And the thing that really struck me about Mount Gibson, because I was going into it looking at it from a Numbat perspective and particularly from a shelter perspective, was just the absolute incredible shelter that was available. And I think that's the richness of these sites that have been managed well over time, is you have, things like these, coarse woody debris on the ground. We had to add actually a category to our shelter just called debris pile, because there was so much, incredible, just piles of woody debris on the ground that things could shelter in that you don't necessarily account for when you're used to landscapes that are, more degraded and just have shelters here and there. There's these old York gums that, some of them, I swear, must have had 100 shelters in them. And so again, on our data sheets, we, was like nearest shelter. And we're like, this is an impossible thing to quantify in this scenario. So it was really, blew my mind in terms of, what I'd seen in terms of the availability of this kind of shelters and what was on the ground. There was also these, interspersed kind of small acacia stands. And again, at first, in terms of Numbat habitat, we thought we were actually just kind of, driving past those relatively quickly thinking, oh, we won't see any Numbats in there. And then we kept seeing a ton of Numbats as we were driving by. And we tried very hard to start catching them in there because it was so interesting. And once you got into there, the amount of burrows in there from the burrowing animals that have been reintroduced were incredible. And so you could barely step without having a burrow all around you. So again, some of the things we were trying to quantify in terms of the shelter sheet data sheets, we had to really, think about and modify to say, how can we say, again, what's the closest burrow? How deep does it go? Which ones are connected? And so that was really just striking to us, kind of the diversity of habitat we were seeing numbats and just the incredible amount of shelter for all species, but particularly numbats. I think it was really, yeah, just, one of those things where you can never anticipate what it's actually going to look like. So it's always really fun.
Yeah, fantastic. I still haven't been to Mount Gibson, but I will get there one day.
Yeah.
Also amazing to hear the burrows created by other species that we've reintroduced there, things like bilbies, some of the bettongs, actually creating habitat, creating extra shelter for numbats, and presumably for other, extant species that were there previously. So sort of improving habitat by adding new shelter sites. An interesting component of those reintroductions, also modifying the habitat.
Yeah, you can definitely see that right away. It's probably one of the most striking things. And again, you read about that so much. We know they're ecosystem engineers, and that's a term we hear a lot about. But I think that visual is when you really see the impact of that, the scale of the burrows and just the soil movement on the ground. As an aside, I've been to a couple, doing some wombat work recently as well, and have seen the same sort of thing at the larger scale. Whenever you see these burrowing animals that really dig into the landscape and move that soil around and aerate the soil, but also create, these underground, chambers that create, burrows underground have really incredible thermal properties. And so they can really protect things, from that humidity and temperature in a way that some of the hollow logs can't, because again, you can think about that airflow in terms of underground isn't getting in the same way. So it's having that diversity of shelter types in the landscape is really important in terms of, preserving a range of biodiversity under a range of conditions. And yeah, like I said, the visual on that is so different than just, reading the term ecosystem engineer. You go out there and you see they're definitely engineering the environment.
Yeah, I had to share this photo mainly because it's an extremely cute photo of a numbat,
So
but
cute.
it is also emerging from a little burrow that you can see on the right-hand side of the image there. So, yeah, visual evidence of that interaction between different reintroduced species and how they're modifying the landscape. Okay, so you're at Mount Gibson, it's super hot, you're having to work from a small air-conditioned office space, the only air conditioning you've got on the sanctuary.
Mm.
Good conditions for the study, lots of great numbat habitat and plenty of numbats around. Just to step back a little bit, why is increasing temperature potentially a problem for animals and for things like numbats, small mammals?
Well, the extreme temperatures, I mean, there's a couple of different aspects of this when we talk about increasing temperatures. So on the one hand, we hear a lot about the mean temperature increases around, is it going to be more than 1.5 on average, more than 2.0 on average? And these mean increases that we see over time really are going to drive these community and systematic changes in the environment. And so when we have those kind of, mean changes in rainfall and temperature, you might see a community change from one habitat type to another over time because that's what it's used to. And that's going to take a number of years. In the shorter term, what we're already seeing from the increased temperature is this increase in extreme events. And included in that is extreme heat waves, so the actual daily temperature. So we have more days over 40, more nights over 25. And these are really what, globally have been defined as extremely or very hot conditions. So if you have a day over 40 and it doesn't cool off to less than 25 at night, you don't get that relief at nighttime. And once you have 3 days of that consecutively, then you can have a heat wave. And that's when things really physiologically on animals become quite taxing because it takes energy to stay cool. You might take more energy to get the food that you're looking for. You're hotter, you can't move around as much. And so those changes in terms of the taxing energy it takes and the lack of energy you're getting are really, why it matters that things are so hot in terms of extreme heat. With that, you also get, these other extreme events. So while generally rainfall is much more unpredictable than temperature changes, what we do know is that for every degree it's hotter, you get around a 7 to 10% increase in the intensity of rainfall. So what we've seen is when rain is coming, it's coming, it sheets down. We probably have all experienced that. I know where I live, when rain comes, it just sheets down. And we see that more and more. And that's going to be, you have hot, dry temperatures. So your soil is going to get quite hydrophobic, and then you have this sheeting rain and it's going to run off. So you have these cumulative combination of extreme events that are causing the environment to be unpredictable for animals in terms of the resources they're getting, but also physiologically directly how the animal might cope with those temperatures. So it's a real double whammy, if you will.
there's so many different sort of mechanisms through which climate change can impact us. You know, we think about bushfires in the southeast, changing fire patterns in other parts of Australia, you know, ocean temperature increasing, all of these things. But it's sort of, you know, one aspect of this study is quite simple. It's literally just the air is too hot for the animals to be comfortable or to do the things that they need to do to survive. So that's one part of it. But these animals didn't come down in the last shower. They've actually got responses to extreme weather, including temperature. What are some of the ways that animals respond in conditions like that?
Well, kind of like, you know, we've just kind of shown with the burrow. So mostly taking shelter. So very similar to humans, you know, humans take shelter in air conditioned environments or passive cooling. And I think, you know, passive cooling is a really good way to think about how animals are looking for burrows. And so when we've studied different burrows of animals, we realize that, you know, it's not usually random, the burrows that they're picking. So it's quite specific conditions that animals are looking for in a burrow. And it's a combination of both, you know, protection from heat and a bit of that humidity. Because again, like any of us know, heat and humidity together are what really, you know, are taxing for particularly mammals. And so, you know, animals can either, you know, go underground, go in rock shelters, go in places that provide a little bit of a microclimate for them to shelter from that heat.
And so the Numbats are using all of that shelter that you were describing, I suppose, at Mount Gibson, you know, hollow logs, burrows, as you would as a person, seek out the shade, seek out the cooler sort of local parts of the habitat, I guess.
Yeah, and shade's a really another important factor of that because again, one of the challenges is you can't actually just stay in your burrow all the time because again, you need that energy. So numbats are really tied to one of the things with numbats that makes them a bit vulnerable to this heat is that they have such a specific food source. And that's really a general thing we see. You know, specialist animals that don't have flexibility in their resources can be a bit more vulnerable to these types of things because they have to eat, you know, one or two things. So if those one or two things are either impacted themselves directly or only available at a certain time, then the animal doesn't have as much choice. So for numbats, they actually have to eat termites while they're running in their galleries. And so they can't, you know, they're pretty weak diggers. So they actually don't have the option to like, you know, any time of day go to a big termite mound. It's when the termites are active in the galleries when the numbats have to access them. And so really what we've seen with termites in other times of year is that they're tracking when these termites are active, which tend to be again during these diurnal periods. So the numbats kind of have to come out while it's somewhat warm in order to get, you know, their food resources. So one of the things that we kind of predicted they might be at risk from in terms of extreme heat is that while they're sheltering from the heat so they don't get overheated, they might not be getting enough resources to kind of, you know, get them through in terms of energy. And that's really the trade-off that these animals might be looking at is, yep, I might stay cool, but I'm going to be, you know, I might get too hungry and potentially malnourished if it goes too far. And that's the thing with these cumulative heat events. If they have to shelter for too long, what's the impact of that? And that really goes back to some of that, what you're saying about shade in the environment. One of the things that, you know, Mount Gibson, you know, had a really nice environment from that perspective is that shade and the importance of these microclimates protecting them from, you know, we can say it's 40, but, you know, that's the kind of, you know, what a weather station might say as the average air temperature right then. But getting the temperature in these little microclimates is really what matters to the animals when they're in a place that's sheltered from the sun.
Yep. Okay, so in the short term, animals do have techniques or, you know, sort of behaviors, I guess, that help them cope with extreme heat. What about in the longer term? What are some of the factors that determine whether a species persists or changes, you know, over a broad area where it's living? How much do we know about what determines whether or not species are able to persist?
I think that's a space where, you know, we can really, you know, look to things, you know, classically like evolution. And so one of the things we've learned in the last, you know, few decades now, actually, is that rapid adaptation is possible. You know, historically, we really thought about evolution as a very slow process and, you know, and aspects of evolution still are slow, but we also see aspects of evolution that can be quite rapid in terms of things adapting. And so that's a really powerful thing we can manage in terms of making sure we, you know, maximize how much genetic diversity these populations have And so when you think about evolution, evolution kind of needs diversity. You need these different genes in the gene pool for selection to act upon. And so that's one of the places that AWC is quite active in all the threatened species management that we do, is we really focus on making sure there's as much diversity in these gene pools and these fenced populations as possible, so that, you know, when it gets hot, they have the best chance to have something there that might help them. Because again, we're not quite sure what that might be, so we want to maximize the options there. In that same vein, we also want them to be exposed to a lot of different conditions. And so one of the other things we can do is make sure that we have multiple populations in really different environments. And again, with Numbats, it's a really good example of how AWC has been really proactive, because we've got Numbats not only at Mount Gibson. Mount Gibson is actually the hottest site that we've got them at, but Yucumar and Scotia are quite different, as is Mallee Cliffs. And so by spreading them out around different parts of the environment, we're making sure that they're exposed to all these different environmental conditions, which is a bit of future proofing in terms of what might happen in different areas. And so different selective pressures on the populations make sure that we're, again, taking a bit of a hedging your bets policy on, you know, what might be useful in the future for this species.
Mm. Tim mentioned in the introduction just the sort of high power in our science team. And I know that genetics is something you have a really strong background in, as well as this climate modeling. And so the idea of adaptive capacity, of giving species the genetic diversity that makes healthy populations, but also, you know, managing across different climatic zones, that sort of ties together two of the areas that you and, you know, others on the science team have this really, really strong track record. So yeah, it must be fun for you to bring those two threads together.
Yeah, I really think it's inexplicably linked. And so to me, it just makes sense, where I think, you know, one of the you know, most powerful actions we can take really is relying on nature itself. And that really is evolution, isn't it? And so, you know, we know things are changing, and what we can do then is, I think, you know, give species the best chance to adapt to those changes. And that's really, you know, that base level of biodiversity is genetic diversity. And so, you know, again, we just, it's just part of, I think, that responsibility we have to conserve and manage that really well. And I think that's really one of AWC's strengths, is making sure that we provide for those natural processes to help us in terms of the management of these species as well.
It's also where I think there is room for hope. And, you know, we sort of framed that at the beginning of this conversation, that it can seem pretty gloomy when you look at the projections and sort of outlook for different parts of Australia. But we do know that ecosystems and species can respond, and they can be really resilient in surprising ways, in ways that we don't always predict. So I think this idea of adaptive capacity is, I find it really hopeful as well. Back to the field work. Okay, so you're at Mount Gibson, it's a heat wave, and there are numbats running around. What was the data that you wanted to collect from that period in the field?
This was one of the, I just will say, the coolest studies I've gotten to work on, because we were able to come together and collect so much data. We had this incredible technology where we had worked with some people in Europe to design some collars that I think had more technology on a tiny little collar than had been really tried before. And then with that, like I said, we kind of added a few different layers in terms of the shelters as well. So starting kind of with the Numbat, we had these collars that we had designed that had the box you can see on the bottom is an accelerometer, which is essentially like the smartwatches that we all, you know, walk around with on our arms now. So that accelerometer tracked, you know, on 3 different axes, their movement 25 times a second. So if you think about the wealth of the data we had, we knew kind of at all times what this animal was doing, including in their shelters. And then, you know, we had a traditional VHF radio collar on it, so we could track them to their shelters. And that allowed us to take all these measurements on shelters, both during the day and at night. So one of the things we really wanted to understand is, you know, when they were coming out of their shelters, so what time of day that was in relation to the heat, how long they were spending outside of their shelters, so did it change with the heat, and then, you know, how much they were moving around. So did they have to, you know, did they not go as far to get, you know, their foraging done essentially when it was really hot? And then we wanted to find out, you know, what kind of shelters, you know, were they making different choices about shelters in these different heat conditions? On a really hot day, you know, we would predict potentially they'd use more burrows than the hollows and logs. And then finally with that, we wanted to actually measure the conditions of those shelters. And we did that through both just kind of, like I said, we had these shelter data sheets to say, what was it? Was it log? Was it a hollow? Was it a burrow? But we also used, again, more technology in this scenario to measure really exact things about it. So we use these little buttons called eye buttons that measure both temperature and humidity. And so within 24 hours of an animal, being found in a shelter, we would go back and wait to not disturb them. And we will put an eye button in for 5 days so that we could track in those conditions what the shelter conditions actually were in terms of the temperature and humidity. And we actually set up a local weather station at Mount Gibson as well, so we could get really local weather conditions. So we knew, what the animal was doing at all times in terms of coming in and out of the burrow. We knew how it was moving around, how far it was moving around. And then we also knew what kind of shelter conditions it was taking. Now, one of the really, cool things about this as well is because it's such fine data, we could tell whether we haven't analyzed the data to this level as yet because it's going to take a while with the, wealth of data that we have. That's the hard side of this study, is whether or not they use something called torpor. And so torpor is this really ingenious thing that animals have. It's almost like a daily hibernation. So everybody knows kind of bears hibernate in the winter. They shut down, their hearts barely, beat, and that saves energy for an animal. And this kind of behavioral adaptation is the kind of thing that really can save an animal in this kind of condition. So if it's really hot and they're not getting enough termites, well, that's okay if they're going into torpor all the time. So we know Numbats use torpor in the winter when it's cold. We know they physiologically have the capacity to use torpor. And we know in the arid zone when it's really hot, other animals, have used torpor. So answering this question is also really powerful to know, like, if we just were measuring whether or not they had enough time out for termites, but didn't know if they had torpor, we might be more worried than we need to be. So again, there's these incredibly clever things in the environment. So 25 times a second, if an animal's just in its burrow sleeping, you twitch, you move around a little bit. But if you're in torpor, it's going to be a dead flat signal. So we'll actually be able to pick up whether or not these animals are using torpor in this heat, which is going to be a huge contribution to them saving that energy and not needing as many termites.
The technology that's available to us now as ecologists is just incredible. I mean, the things you're describing, it's like the step count, are they getting their 10,000 steps every day? They probably are, I think. It's the smart home of, having a thermostat that, tells you what the temperature is in your house throughout the whole day. And then the weather station as well. So you actually set up a custom weather station to have local data. Was that right?
Yeah, just up at Mount Gibson Ranger Station, we had a weather station that every, I think, 30 minutes downloaded the whole suite of things so that we could track. Because again, you have the closest weather station, but you see so much variability even at fine scale. So really, we wanted to know at, Mount Gibson, what were the conditions directly. Yeah.
And powering these incredible collars, traditionally you'd be relying on a battery pack, which adds weight to the devices. There are limits, obviously, to the size of collars that you can put onto animals and, ethical considerations about that. But these ones had another innovation to help power them for longer. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, again, this was just one of the coolest things. This has a solar panel on the top. So I don't know if you can just see on the top of that, it's a bit shiny and black. And that flat piece on top of the battery on top was able to power this collar. And so we talked to people who had similar collars to this. And had we not had that with the kind of, data we were collecting, we would expect this collar to last for maybe 8 days before we'd have to recatch the animal, charge it, and then either you have the choice of, do you keep the animal? We wanted the same animals throughout the study because, again, you're not introducing too much confounding things with different behaviors. And so we collared 10 different animals, so we got variation among the animals, but wanted to keep the same ones. And so we were able to save not only, the stress on the animal and the work for the people recatching it, but we were able to, get that continuous data. So we were able to download the data by just getting close to the animal as well. So you can kind of test, is the battery okay? So again, if things were getting short, we'd know we'd be able to catch up the animal. So the technology in terms of being able to go close with the laptop, you couldn't do it from the station, but while we were tracking the animals and going to the shelter, we could have a laptop with us. We were close enough. We could, do a remote download and ask the caller from that far away, how much battery do you have left? And know that the solar panel was actually working. So that was one of the pluses of it being an incredibly sunny time out there. But, it's until you try this, you just never know if this tiny little solar panel is actually working in terms of charging it. So I find that to be a game changer in terms of having to recatch animals is quite, stressful for the animal. It's very time consuming. It's a real limitation you have in terms of that. And, with larger animals, we've had a lot of these luxuries for a long time. So for the technology to start getting down to the scale where we can use it for the smaller animals is really going to change things in terms of understanding physiologically, how these small animals cope with things compared to larger things.
Mm. Incredible stuff. And yeah, so different to the olden days of not very long ago, walking out with a radio tracker to try and pick up a signal and triangulate it from different points, or moving quickly to get another read.
Yeah. We did that too. We did that too. That was how we found him. So yeah, the one thing is we had GPS in the collars as well. And that was the one thing where the collars, there wasn't enough battery to run both at all times. And so we had a couple of collars that worked here and there, but the way we had it programmed was when the battery did get low, it would put all of its energy towards the accelerometer as the priority. And so we decided pretty early on that we would just focus on, because the GPS would have then given us, this incredible wealth of data of, all of their habitat movement as well and how they're moving around. But that was pushing it a little bit too far in terms of how much the solar power battery could provide. So we just decided to turn that off and maximize the information. And so the crews did still do the classic, to find them in their shelters, which I have to say I did a little bit, when I was out there with them. And as you still have the classic bounce, you walk in circles and circles a little bit until you finally find it. So some things don't change for a long time.
I mean, it's a classic experience for a young ecologist. So great.
Young and old.
Yeah. So an incredible wealth of data that you've described, these fine scale movements, the use of different habitat features, how the animals' bodies are changing over the course of a day and weeks, as well as information about the conditions on the site. So what can we do with all of that? Interpreting is obviously a huge job in itself, but what are sort of the options of different hypotheses that we might pick up when we're looking at this data?
Well, this is going to basically really directly inform our management actions for this species and also help us fine tune, I think, things that we will value learning about other species that we want to manage under these conditions. So, even looking at the data so far, what we can see is that during the day, they're using burrows more than at night. So we would have predicted that. As we look at the data more closely, we'll be able to find the conditions of the burrows that they use in these hot conditions. That'll allow us to go to other sites and identify whether or not they're suitable burrows. Because again, a burrow is not a burrow is not a burrow. So what we can do is say, okay, what are the temperature and humidity conditions under this heat? And we can also look a little bit more into termites and other sites and say, okay, what kind of foraging did they have to do during that time? One of the things that we've done since then is, working with a PhD student who's helping us analyze this data. She's now gone to Perth Zoo and videoed animals with these collars on, which means not only do you know when they're moving, exactly because of the different axes, when they're foraging, when they're running. So we'll be able to actually quantify how much of that time was spent foraging. And that really will directly tell us more about what resources they need. So again, helps us evaluate other sites that have the different conditions. And then also, we can manage what they need through the hard times. And so, if some places, if we need to help, there's options for artificial burrows, let's say, if we want to modify things in some ways to make sure those conditions are good. So I think that helps us fine tune our understanding of where we can put numbats and what they need in terms of resources and what is too extreme and what isn't. I think it's, we might find that they have a lot of ability to behaviorally adapt to what's going on. And that will give us an opportunity to put them in a wider range of places than we might otherwise, which is going to benefit the species long term in terms of those selective pressures again. I think more broadly, to me, this is really exciting in terms of, numbats are diurnal, so it's really easy to think, oh, we need to learn, what's going to happen in the heat. But hot nights are something that we're learning are a real threat for everything. As the nights aren't cooling down, that's traditionally when everything gets a bit of a relief. And the nocturnal animals we have here are used to being a certain cool temperature where they're foraging. So those animals are also going to be stressed more than normal in those conditions. And so this technology allows us to shift from looking at this really, broad scale approach where we're starting to understand, things like climate envelopes of where they might be able to persist to more those, behavioral adaptations they already have and the kind of microclimate conditions that they need on sites to survive. So I feel like this is just the beginning of the types of things that are really going to help us learn specific management actions that we need to take for the suite of species we're focusing on.
Mm. That's so hopeful. And I think it's sort of typical of AWC's approach that, yes, stopping things going extinct is very important. It's critical. But beyond that, we actually want numbats everywhere. We want numbats back in all of those landscapes where they're missing from. And to do that, we need this rich information that studies like this are unlocking, stuff that we've never been able to find out before about those specific requirements. Yeah, I think it's very proactive kind of research. And like you say, it translates directly into action, into what can we do for this species. Do you think there's scope that will identify new sites that numbats would be able to persist in that we haven't currently identified?
Potentially new sites, and just I think, in general, what we've looked at is kind of their, historic distribution. And I think, what we've looked at, like I said, at that big scale, we look at the historic distribution and we look at how that's changing in terms of climate projections into the future. And what we'll be able to pair that with is how much those changes in the future might actually impact them given what kind of behavioral adaptations they have. And then we can pair that with, how we can kind of help manage that adaptive capacity as well. So if we know that they have, behavioral adaptations that allow them to cope with extreme heat, and then we have the ability to provide, a really genetically diverse source population, we might be able to put them in places that are, in line with what we feel like they can cope with. So I think, we might not have to, I guess, if you say, coddle things quite as much. Sometimes I think, with climate change, we start to think, oh, we can only, everything has to go down to Tasmania. It's really cool. And that we can't do that. We have to continue to look to how we can have things across the distribution be restored. And that will help the landscape be resilient as well. And I think that's really what that helps us with, is a really holistic view of restoring biodiversity and how all the different things have their different adaptations that will help us, put them back and learn what we need to focus on managing in those landscapes to facilitate that.
Yeah. Great. Jenny, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Rich pickings, I think, and we will share the recording. So if anyone wants to go back and listen to, what we talked about with the technology there, then the sort of data it's unlocking, there's a lot in it. I hope you've also seen the article in Wildlife Matters that Jenny co-authored. So there's a really good sort of summary of this work and why it's important in our most recent magazine, Wildlife Matters. Another article in there about biodiversity, which I also thought was pretty good. Tim, I'll bring you back in at this point. I think this is really inspiring work and, fits squarely within AWC's mission of effective conservation informed by science. It's a great example of putting that into action.
Absolutely. It's and there's a whole number of things about what Jenny's just talked about that are important and resonate both at a professional level, but quite a personal level as well. That today is my 13th year anniversary with AWC. It's when I joined AWC 13 years ago. And it was very quickly after today, it was about a fortnight within my time, and Martin Copley said, go build a fence at Mount Gibson. And I had to figure out what a fence meant, and then go to Mount Gibson and figure out where to put a fence. And there was a lot of work went into all of that work. And we developed the vision of the restoration of 10 regionally extinct species. And to think where we're at a point today where not only have we achieved that vision of Martin's, we've been releasing species beyond the fence and now undertaking research into critical issues like the numbat and its ability to withstand the impact of a changing climate, which is critical for Mount Gibson, but it's critical for, as Jenny said, and how we restore species across the landscape. How do we bring species like numbats back into their traditional ranges? Because one of those key fundamental issues is ecosystem restoration, ecosystem resilience. And we get that by bringing these species back in with those digging and foraging animals that start to restore the function of the ecosystems in which they live. This is going to be a part of the critical importance for Australia as we build up resilience and adaptability to a changing climate.
I hope people watching this have felt inspired. I know that many of you have donated generously to our campaign supporting this work and, our science and research and land management work around the country. Tim, for anyone who has yet to donate, would you say this is a good season just before Christmas?
I would say this is a perfect time, Joey, just before Christmas. We've got 39 Jennies running around Australia doing the work that Jenny does, 39 PhDs. And that's for an organisation the size of AWC and that depth of knowledge and experience and capability matched with the land management program. That is remarkable, but it only comes about because of the support you've provided to us. The support, which is financial support, absolutely. It is the support you also provide us at a personal level of just making sure you've got our backs and we can get on and still do this great work that we're trying to achieve. So as we're heading into Christmas and the new year, thank you very much for your gifts. And particularly, there's an important cohort of people have left gifts in their wills to us as bequests to AWC, which helps provide security and surety to us into the future. So that's quite profound and very special. And for the conversations I've had with people who've done that, thank you very much, because it's very impactful. And again, if you've yet to make a gift this year, please do. Please think about it. How can you not listen to Jenny and not make a contribution to AWC? She's a remarkable person. She's a remarkable human. The work that she does is excellent, and it's critical to what we're going to do in the future. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for what you do in your communities for the conservation, and have a great Christmas and New Year period.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks again, Jenny. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Merry Christmas from me too, and see you later.